This guy is Zalker, the first failed awakened of the illustrious Draker family. Why is that? Because he was born into a great family of legendary dragon slayers, yet his body was so pathetic that he couldn't even use aura. The very power that every knight possesses, Zeke failed to awaken. It was something that should have been impossible for a knight. Because of this, he was treated like trash and kicked out of the family. Zeke's life was a constant struggle, forcing him to do whatever it took just to get stronger and survive. For example, stealing an ancient artifact, something said to grant extraordinary power. But unfortunately for him, the Emperor was also searching for that exact same artifact. To get his hands on it, the Emperor didn't hesitate to dispatch a massive legion just to hunt Zeke down after he acquired it. Outnumbered and overwhelmed, and unable to use aura, Zeke quickly found himself at a severe disadvantage. It got so tragic that the enemy even managed to slice off both of his arms. The first two soldiers who caught up to Zeke even played a coin toss to decide who would get the honor of executing him first. They clearly just saw him as a joke. But in his most desperate moment, a fierce will to live surged within him. He used his mouth to bite down hard on one of his severed arms. Then, using a unique healing power only he possessed, he reattached it. After that, using the very arm he had just reconnected, he picked up his sword and chopped off the heads of those two bastards. Unfortunately, even though he managed to take them down, they had already called for backup. Looking at the massive crowd of enemies swarming toward him, he could only click his tongue, pitying his own fate. Knowing full well that he probably wouldn't escape today, he still calmly picked up his other arm and reattached it. What the? Did he just reattach his severed arm? The pursuing legion was left completely dumbfounded at the sight. What a freak. That's disgusting. We're gonna have to chop his head off to make sure he's actually dead. Now with two fully functioning arms, Zeke used every last ounce of his strength to throw himself back into that lopsided battle. But even though he fought fiercely and took down many men, he still couldn't win in the end. By the end of the fight, his back was pierced with so many swords he looked like a porcupine. Coughing up blood continuously, he could clearly feel his life slipping away. In his final moments, comforting himself with the thought that even if he couldn't get revenge or live a fulfilling life, he had at least managed to steal the artifact the Emperor so desperately wanted. Like achieving some grand milestone, Zeke tremblingly pulled the artifact from his shirt. Blood dripped from his head and the corner of his mouth, landing right on the artifact and causing it to emit a blinding golden light. Then, Zeke heard a strange voice. Your strong will has awakened an ancient power. The soul of an ancient dragon is deeply engraved in the will of the persevering. Emergency protocol activated. Zalker, do you accept? Zeke thought he was hearing things. Or maybe he was hallucinating because he was on the brink of death. But the voice kept repeating in his head. Do you accept? Do you accept? Shut up. Do whatever you want. Annoyed and just wanting the voice out of his head, he yelled. But then he heard it continue. Awakener's agreement confirmed. An irreversible promised power is being activated. Countdown initiating. 4. When the countdown ended, all he saw was a blinding white light, and he couldn't hear anything anymore. He thought he had finally passed on to the afterlife. But when he regained consciousness, Zeke realized he was in the body of a child. That's right. It was hard to believe, but not only did he not die, he had been reborn and sent back to the past. Zeke could still clearly remember the agonizing pain of being pierced by swords, but now, there wasn't a single scratch on his body. Even though a long time had passed, Zeke knew exactly where he was the moment he looked around. He was at the Draker family's training camp. The Dragon Slayer Draker family was one of the three great, transcendent families of this era. Terran Draker was the hero who saved the entire continent by slaying the vicious dragon behemoth in a war 1,000 years ago. His descendants established the Draker family as it is today. Perhaps because they were the descendants of the Dragon Slayer Terran, everyone in the Draker family possessed a bloodline blessed with aura. Because of this, they could easily awaken high-tier aura and become powerful knights. Zeke was the sole exception. That was why he had met such a tragic end in his previous life. Management system rebooting. Just as Zeke laid down on his bed, he heard that strange voice again. He jolted up, looking around in a panic. Zeke was certain there was no one else around, but the voice kept echoing steadily. Identifying the Awakener's soul. The Awakener's soul has been confirmed. 100% compatibility. The chosen Awakener's soul has accepted the will of the ancient dragon and has fully integrated. Confirmed. You have gained access to a portion of the system. A pleasure to meet you, Rick. Activating status window view. Then, Rick saw a multitude of shimmering blue screens appear before him. With the understanding of an ancient, he couldn't define it with the term simulation window, as modern people familiar with RPGs would. But in reality, Rick, like many other reincarnated protagonists, had obtained a system. At that time, Rick couldn't comprehend these strange events, merely thinking it was all accidentally triggered by that artifact. He waved his hands around randomly, and another status window appeared. It was labeled Low-Level Administrator Status Window, along with current information about him. It displayed his current class as a Healing Sorcerer, Rare Level, with the title Blessed by the Ancient Dragon. The class skills Rick possessed were Heal, Calm, Recover, Vitality, and Sensory Boost. Other skills included Precise Stab, E/E, and Critical Hit, E. There was also another section for dragon skills, but it was currently unviewable. The system required 10 points to unlock this section, but his current score was a big fat 0. Rick was astonished by what had just appeared before him. He reached out, trying to grab it, but found it was like mist. His hand could pass right through it. It couldn't be grasped, only navigated by lightly touching its surface. Setting that aside, the information written on the status window also gave Rick pause. The so-called class and skills were all in an ancient draconic language no longer in use. In his previous life, he had a master who had mentioned these things. Early Awakeners classified themselves into classes depending on what they excelled at. Each class would train a specialized technique called a skill. In his past life, Rick's class was also a healing sorcerer, so he could use the skill called Heal. Rick clearly remembered that after awakening, his master's demonic training had nearly sent him to his grave. In any case, according to the status window, Rick was still a healing sorcerer in this life. He wanted to see if what it said was true. In his previous life, the moment he became a healing sorcerer was at the age of 20, right after his ether hall was unlocked. Rick closed his eyes tightly, trying to sense within himself. It was just as he had predicted. In this life, even though he was just a child, his ether hall was already unlocked. Rick finally understood something. After reincarnating, although his previously trained body was gone, he had returned to the past with all his memories and skills. Compared to his previous life, he was now in a much more advantageous position, and Rick could fully leverage this to live a life worth living. But before that, he still had to carefully study what he had in his hands. "Young Master Rick, I'm coming in." Suddenly, a voice from outside the door startled Rick. He hadn't even finished reading all the information on the window, nor did he know how to close it. Before he could figure out what to do, the person outside had already pushed the door open and entered. "No." Rick was so startled he screamed, but it was too late. "I can't believe you're still not ready. What are you thinking, young Master Rick?" Rick recognized this old man. It was Deeker, his personal servant. It seemed he couldn't see the status window. Rick secretly let out a sigh of relief, then asked back, "Ready? Ready for what?" Deeker's eyes suddenly sharpened. Even though he was a servant, Rick could still feel an undeniable sense of intimidation from the old man. "Are you asking me seriously, young Master Rick?" Rick couldn't help but shiver. Come to think of it, he had been truly afraid of Deeker since he was a child in his past life. Now, despite possessing the soul of a 32-year-old man, he couldn't forget the fear that had been deeply ingrained in his body. At that moment, the system automatically activated the class skill, Calm. Instantly, Rick's anxiety was dispelled. This skill prevented the user's psychological state from wavering in any situation before any person. Rick hadn't expected the system to be able to automatically activate skills. It seemed very useful. Deeker, seeing the young master ignore him, continued to remind him, "I have repeated many times that this is an important event. Are you listening, young Master Rick?" "Of course, Deeker. I'm still listening." Rick seemed to have remembered what important event was happening today. "Are you talking about the Pancration evaluation test?" The place where Rick was staying had another name, the Cradle. This was where all members of the Draker family came to undergo a training system starting from the age of 7. For 5 consecutive years, they would go through the most rigorous basic training. The instructors would evaluate new students each year through swordsmanship competitions or no-rules pancration combat. Opponents were chosen by the instructors, but there were cases where students could choose their own opponents if both sides agreed. Because this evaluation had no rules, some would end it with serious injuries, while others would leave the field without their lives. However, this test was still regularly maintained because it was used to select the class that students would attend in the academy later on. So the children had no choice but to use everything they had to fight. Rick grumbled as he changed clothes and left his room to head to the arena. The person in charge today was head instructor Ban Mark. Rick didn't have many memories of this period in his life. But hearing Ban say this was the final part of this year's evaluation, the spirits of all the students were soaring. Rick stood at the front of the line, and he could easily hear the whispers of ridicule coming from the row behind him. It's Rick. He was humiliated last year, and he's still here this year. Tisich, if I were him, I would have run away. How can he be from the direct bloodline? So useless. Rick had to feign deafness. After all, he was already used to being looked down upon like this from his previous life. The test quickly proceeded. The first two students to enter the arena were Aaron and Gata. After instructor Ban's signal, the two of them rushed at each other like hungry tigers. Rick sat on the side, yawning wearily. After just that first move, he already knew this match would end quickly and who the victor would be. Because Gata's stance was improper from the start, and he would soon be knocked out by Aaron. If it were the 12-year-old Rick from his past life, he would surely have been terrified watching this bloody scene of punches and kicks. But he had already lived through one life, a miserable life where he couldn't use aura and had to rely solely on physical combat. So, the students now were nothing to Rick. Throughout their match, he just sat listlessly on the observation deck, yawning. Rick had no idea that on the opposite side of the stands, a kid was staring intently at him with an incredibly hungry gaze. That kid's name was Leon, and he was also Rick's opponent in the next match. It wasn't until he stepped into the arena that he realized, at this point in time, Leon was significantly taller than him. And he was the one who had beaten Rick to a pulp last year. So when he saw Rick return for this year's test, Leon was overjoyed. It's just that times were different now. Who would lose at whose hands was yet to be seen. If you want to live, then beg, you weak parasite, Leon said provocatively. Leon reminded Rick of his own pathetic state last year and the year before that. Leon had always been his opponent, and not once had he won. Rick was certain he had cheated behind his back because his family was the type to whisper such nonsense into their child's ear. Things like, you have to resort to such dirty tricks to become a true dragon slayer. Leon had been brainwashed by his parents since he was a child, so his talent was limited, but his schemes were boundless. The more Rick looked, the more of an eyesore his opponent became. He couldn't understand how such trash could be his cousin. In his previous life, he had 4 siblings from the direct Draker bloodline, but they never even had the chance to meet. However, he had the opportunity to meet a dozen of his cousins, and they were always ready to bully him, no matter when. Hey, I have to admit it, Rick Draker. You're really brave to come back here after getting beaten to a pulp last year. Or is there something wrong with your head? Leon continued his provocations. If it were the Rick of this age from his past life, he would probably be scared or angry. But now, inside this young body was a man in his 30s. Moreover, the system automatically activated the calm skill, making Rick completely indifferent to his opponent's insults. Hey, I won't go easy on you if you keep insulting me like that, Rick warned his opponent. It was mainly because Leon's incessant whining was giving him a headache. But in Leon's eyes, he was just a useless weakling, the disgrace of the family. Therefore, when he heard Rick speak, he even found it ridiculous. Instead of just trading insults, Leon stepped forward and grabbed his hair. So what are you going to do, huh? You lowly good-for-nothing. No one saw clearly what Rick did next. They only saw that in a flash, he had sent Leon flying. That was because Rick had unintentionally used the critical hit skill. Just as its name suggests, this skill allows the user to inflict critical damage on the enemy. In case of a failed attack, they could also be countered with a similar force. Leon clutched his face, screaming in pain. Rick was also a bit surprised. He had only intended to knock his opponent unconscious, but his skill had been activated by accident when he threw that punch. Although the effect of the blow was excellent, It pointed to the fact that Rick couldn't control his abilities well yet. "What are you doing, Rick Draker?" Ban rushed over to Leon in a panic. "How dare you attack before I even declared the start? Does anyone declare ready, set, go on a battlefield? The one who strikes first gains the advantage, don't you know, sir?" Rick retorted. It wasn't his words, but the bloodthirsty look in Rick's eyes that made Ban unconsciously shiver. It was something he had never seen in him before. Leon finally managed to catch his breath. He said he was fine and asked Ban to let the match continue. Even though his nose was still bleeding profusely, Rick's punch seemed to have flipped Leon's combat switch. He swore that today he would make sure Rick wouldn't walk out of the arena alive. Leon staggered to his feet. After Ban signaled the start of the match, he charged towards Rick like an arrow. Rick was still quite hesitant, afraid that he would once again fail to control the force of his blow. And Leon, after that punch, had become much more cautious. Therefore, the attack from Rick's left hand became too obvious in his eyes. In that moment, Leon dodged the punch from his left hand. At the same time, he successfully grabbed Rick's thigh. Just one more step, and he could slam Rick hard onto the ground. Ban thought the battle would end like that. But the scene that unfolded before him next made his jaw drop. His eyes were glued to Rick, unable to believe that such combat since belonged to a 12-year-old boy. The moment Leon dodged Rick's punch and was about to slam him down, Ban thought he would win. However, Rick reacted as quick as lightning, striking Leon hard on the chin while simultaneously escaping his grasp. This was entirely Leon's fault for letting his guard down, thinking he had caught Rick. But what amazed Ban was Rick's calmness despite his own attack having just failed. Did the terrifying focus and precision required to deliver such an effective and accurate blow really belong to the Rick Draker everyone had known until now? As for Leon, after taking 2 consecutive punches, he had nearly lost his mind. Leon had to create some distance before Rick could launch another wave of attacks. But he was still a bit slower than him. The idea of creating distance had just formed in his head when Rick kicked him hard in the shin. It was clear that he was smaller than Rick, but the force of his punches and kicks was astonishingly powerful. Leon felt like his leg was about to break, but his mouth still wouldn't shut. He continuously called Rick a lowly good-for-nothing. His blood boiled, and he no longer cared about creating distance. All Leon could do now was charge forward and attack instinctively. And unfortunately for him, after a few blows, Rick could now control his strength. In addition, he activated the sensory boost skill, temporarily increasing the sharpness of his senses. Leon's punches, which tore through the air, became very slow to Rick because of this. This made him feel more like he was taking a stroll than participating in a competition. Now that he was used to controlling the power from his ether hall, Rick no longer had time to play cat and mouse with his opponent. He grabbed his arm, then slammed his body hard onto the ground. If it were a normal person, this move alone would have been enough to strip them of their ability to fight. But Rick had no intention of letting his opponent off the hook. He activated the precise stab skill again. Then, he used his elbow as a sword, stabbing straight into the weak point on his opponent's chest. "Stop!" Leon gasped for breath in pain while moaning. "Even a fool like you must have learned a lesson you'll never forget after this, right?" Rick replied, but his hands didn't stop punching. Not just Ban Mark, but all the students present were so scared their faces turned pale. Rick now looked exactly like a madman venting his anger. It wasn't until Leon lay still and motionless that he stood up, satisfied. He then turned towards the stands, where the students were standing and staring at him. "A little sweat will clear your head. Now, does anyone here have an opinion? You can all come down at once." This challenge from Rick was an eyesore to quite a few people. But not everyone dared to stand up after seeing him beat Leon into that state. Finally, from within the crowd, a teenager stood up. Rick recognized him. It was Zagel Kane, another one of his cousins. But his character was on par with Leon's, a 9 to his 10. Zagel wanted to challenge Rick, and naturally, he had no reason to refuse. It's just that he was a bit tired of one-on-one fights with these snot-nosed kids. So he personally appointed one more person, Liam Stone, Zagel's servant, to join. "I think that's the only way to make this fight fair." Rick added another comment that made Zakin's eyes turn red with anger. "Did you just insult me?" he shrieked. "That's right, you idiot," Rick replied with an enthusiastic tone and sparkling eyes. Seeing him like that, Zakin got so angry that the veins on his face bulged. Just like Leon before, he swore he would take Rick's life today. This time, Instructor Pan had learned his lesson. He repeatedly reminded Rick not to attack before he gave the signal. Yeah, I know, Rick nodded curtly, his eyes still fixed on his opponent. But the person he was watching wasn't the idiot Zakin, but his servant, Liam. In his previous life, he was known as the Mercenary King. Just like in the past, as Zakin's servant, he had also joined this training facility. But because he was just a distant relative, Liam was almost forgotten and not properly educated. He begged to attend advanced studies at the Valhalla Academy, but was rejected. In the end, he joined a knightly order of a small nation called Baranon. After Baranon fell, he officially became a mercenary. During the chaotic era when people flocked to the strong, Liam became a shining star. Eventually, after a long time as a mercenary, he became an outstanding knight and established his own mercenary army, the Stone Mercenaries. Later, Liam unified the 3 largest mercenary guilds on the continent, and the title Mercenary King was officially born. In his previous life, Liam, as the leader of the Stone Mercenaries, participated in the Great Continental War. Rick, under the alias Ghost of the North, fought alongside the Northerners against him as a mortal enemy. Undeniably, Liam gave him a very hard time. However, this time, things might be different. Begin. Pan's voice cut through Rick's reminiscence. Almost at the same time the command was given, Zakin lunged forward with a fearsome punch, and it was caught firmly by Rick. His eyes suddenly turned cold, looking at Zakin as if he were a pile of trash. I told you to come at me together. Even his tone was icy. But Zakin quickly struggled free. You think I'd fall for your cheap tricks? He said, stepping back to launch a kick. But it seemed that due to his anger, this kick had even more openings than the previous punch. It hit Rick's elbow. Not only did it fail to injure Rick, but it also made his own leg throb with pain. Instinctively, he looked down at his leg. But this was an incredibly foolish move in the middle of a fight. Because Rick, in less than a second, had closed the distance and thrown a punch straight into the kid's stomach. Instantly, he spat out a mouthful of blood and collapsed to the ground. Only now did Zakin accept that he couldn't beat Rick. He screamed, Liam, kill this bastard for me. Liam, who had been standing still and waiting, only began to slowly approach after Zakin gave the order. Looking at his tall build, it was hard to imagine this kid was the same age as him. He had fought Liam many times before, and the most annoying thing, when dealing with him, was his incredible reach. If he let his opponent strike first, Rick would be completely on the defensive. Therefore, he wanted to seize the initiative by attacking first. Rick put his thought into action. He immediately activated his E-rank flurry skill. It allowed him to unleash a series of attacks on his opponent, obstructing their vision. The students in the stands could only gape in astonishment at the scene. They couldn't even keep up with Rick's movements. He had anticipated this. Because this was the Central Lands, a place dominated by the sword. How could these kids possibly recognize the unique northern fist-fighting technique he had just used? However, in this fight, he was still at a disadvantage. Because his body as a child was truly the weakest of the weak. Just using that many skills had made Rick's bones ache. Meanwhile, his opponent possessed a physique no different from a monster's. Liam neither counterattacked nor dodged. He just calmly held his guard and took all of Rick's attacks. Compared to when he was the Mercenary King, Rick felt he was even more ferocious now. Rick took a deep breath, clenching his hands into fists. He had seen how strong his opponent's body was. But now, his own body was about to reach its limit. Rick poured all his strength into his right arm, planning to deliver a blow that would break through that defensive stance and take Liam down. But then, suddenly, Liam's eyes flew open, shining brightly. He tilted his head to the right, successfully dodging the attack that Rick had put his all into. It would be a lie to say he wasn't surprised, because Liam truly possessed incredible senses. And unfortunately, after this move, he successfully grabbed Rick's arm, intending to slam him hard onto the ground. The only problem was that Liam was now just a 12-year-old boy. He had the talent, but lacked real combat experience. Meanwhile, Rick had the soul of a 32-year-old man with vast experience from taking too many beatings. The moment Liam grabbed his arm and brought it over his head, Rick successfully used that posture and force to land a powerful punch on the top of his head. No matter how strong Liam was, he was still human. Being hit hard on the head like that, he couldn't help but feel dizzy. Rick seized the opportunity. He once again activated his heightened sense of skill, using his fastest speed. He wrapped his legs tightly around his opponent's neck, because he knew, no matter how strong the opponent's body was, their brain would become paralyzed when deprived of oxygen. That's what Rick thought. But Liam was crazier than he had imagined. He seemed to have gone berserk, fighting with pure instinct. Trying to escape Rick's chokehold, Liam continuously punched and struck his body. But Rick was just as tenacious. He stubbornly kept his opponent in a chokehold. One side relentlessly attacked. The other relentlessly increased the pressure in his calves. Their fight turned into a race of stamina between two people of different sizes. The students held their breath as they watched. With Liam's striking speed, they all thought Rick would lose the match, that he might even be beaten to a pulp. Even Instructor Ban was so tense he forgot to breathe. He had never seen such a thrillingly intense match between two underage kids. After about a minute, the winner was finally decided. Liam's body began to go limp due to the prolonged lack of oxygen. He no longer had the strength to resist, then slowly collapsed completely. Although covered in injuries, Rick had won. Most of the students were gaping in astonishment, unable to believe that Rick had actually won. Only one kid was smiling brightly at this moment, and his smile didn't seem friendly at all. Good, he thought to himself. I expected at least this much from you. The way you've shown yourself now makes you worthy of me taking you down, Rick Draker. After finishing the test with a result that couldn't have been better, Rick returned to his room. Deeker, after hearing that his young master was seriously injured, was very worried and wanted to check his pulse himself. Rick knew that he didn't simply want to check for illness, but wanted to see if he had awakened his aura yet. After changing, Rick held out his hand. Deeker carefully took his hand, then began to take his pulse. What greatly surprised Rick was that Deeker was actually a Blue Knight. His strength was not simple at all. And normally, when checking if a person has awakened, people usually only look at the Dantian. But Deeker was actually very thorough. Just transferring aura into another person's body was difficult enough. Yet he could control it to travel throughout his body with such precision. If he wasn't a Blue Knight, there was no other suitable explanation. Furthermore, not all knights in the world are the same. They are classified by color based on their martial strength and proficiency in operating aura. The white swordsman is the most basic level. Most children who have not undergone the blessing ceremony are swordsmen of this level. Slightly higher is the yellow swordsman, which is the level when you awaken your aura and open your Dantian. Usually, all students at the cradle become yellow swordsmen after the blessing ceremony. The only exception was Rick's terrible case in his previous life. Next, once one has learned to control aura, they receive a new title, Knight. The lowest is the Purple Knight, with the ability limited to being able to enhance a sword with aura. One level higher is the Blue Knight, which is the level when you can manifest a blade of aura. Finally, there is the realm of transcendent beings who have long surpassed normal limits. It is also the realm that Liam had reached in his previous life and that Rick had reached before reincarnating. The Crimson Knight. It is said that above the Crimson Knight, there is also the Black Knight, but throughout history on the entire continent, only a few such monsters have been recorded. After discovering Deeker's true strength, Rick became even more confused. With his abilities, he should be a commander. So why on earth did he become a servant taking care of a young master like him? After thinking for a while without an answer, Rick decided to put this matter aside. The most important thing now was to absolutely not let Deeker discover the power coming from his ether hall. After all, there were only two people in the world who could use the ether hall, so the possibility of him finding out was almost non-existent. Deeker checked Rick's pulse for a long time before letting go of his hand. Then he sighed deeply. Young master, are you perhaps hiding something from me? So Deeker didn't discover anything. Sighing in relief, he also realized that the other party was trying to pressure him into talking. If it were the Rick from his previous life, just hearing Deeker say this, with this tone, would have scared him to death. But now, he was extremely calm, responding smoothly. What's wrong? Are you hiding something from me? Rick asked back. In response was Deeker's silence. After a long while, he spoke again. Why have you suddenly changed so much, young master? At this, Rick stopped, turned his head, and Deeker saw a pair of eyes so cold they chilled him to the bone. You're asking the wrong question, Deeker. You should be asking why it took me until now to change. Many other things will change from now on, but everything is just returning to its rightful place. So all you need to do is follow closely behind me. Got it? Yes, young master. Deeker bowed, formally and respectfully. Although he didn't know the reason, the Rick now had indeed transformed into a different person. As for Rick, he wasn't sure which side Deeker was on right now, and whether he was a pawn planted to watch him. But he was certain he needed to reverse Deeker's loyalty, to keep him by his side and extract necessary information. The problem was who had ordered Deeker to watch him. Rick didn't think it was someone from his mother's side, only assuming it was one of his siblings. The more he thought about it, the more of a headache it became, so he stopped thinking for the time being. Rick went straight down to the personal training room that Deeker had prepared for him. In his past life, because he was too weak, he didn't have the opportunity to access rooms like this when he was young. Now that he saw it, he could only marvel that this family truly lived up to its name. It was just a personal training room, yet it was filled with equipment, lacking nothing. Since he was alone, Rick also took the opportunity to check that thing called the system. Most of the information hadn't changed. Only his /skill, which was at the novice level, had now become proficient. It seemed the more he used it, the more this level increased. It's just that the skills were activated naturally based on Rick's actions. Rick began to have doubts. So does that mean these skills were already available from the beginning? And if he learned something new, would it be added here as another skill? Furthermore, what was the difference between skills and class skills? Because they were both activated similarly. And also, what secret did the so-called dragon skill, which he still couldn't view, hold? Rick tried to click on the dragon skill section. As expected, it still required bonus points to open. The system said that these points could be obtained through killing. Speaking of monsters, there were tons of them in the caves. But to ensure safety, one needed to become at least a purple knight to go there. Furthermore, he was very curious about why he was reincarnated 20 years in the past, and what this system was. He only knew that it was definitely related to that ancient treasure. The remaining information was too scarce, so for now, Rick couldn't draw any conclusions. He only knew that this thing could help him become stronger, and that alone was reason enough for him to continue using it. Rick lifted a sword with this weak body. Then he began to sense himself. In this world, there were two known powers, the aura of knights and the mana of mages. Knights strengthen the aura in their dantian, while mages operate mana with a magic circle surrounding their heart. These two powers were at opposite poles, so once you awaken one type, you were incompatible with the other. In his past life, Rick was so unlucky that he couldn't awaken either his dantian or his magic circle. He was rejected by his own family. Then he had the good fortune to meet his master during his wandering days. He taught Rick many things, but the most useful things he was taught were the art of healing and the ether hall. Through the ether hall, which his master developed, he was able to use the energy of nature. Because of this, Rick and his master became the only two people in the world who could use ether. However, awakening aura was still a good thing. Whether he could do it in this life depended on fate. Rick started practicing with the sword, but after only 2 hours, he felt like he was about to faint. This body was truly terrible. He leaned on his sword, panting heavily. At that moment, the system automatically activated the class skills Heal and Vitality Recovery. That heal was a very rare skill that he didn't even know existed, until he met his master. If he used it in front of everyone, Rick would surely be considered a freak. That's why he couldn't use it in the fight against Liam. He had to quickly heal his wounds right after returning to his room. With it, Rick practically had an endless source of energy. When it ran out, he'd replenish it. When it ran out again, he'd replenish it again. However, he couldn't depend on it. So he still had to train like his life depended on it to strengthen this body. For now, Rick had trained until dinner time, and the room had been turned upside down to the point where its original shape was unrecognizable. And so, for a whole week, the students at the training camp started whispering about something. That Rick, the family's failure, had now become a completely different person. They even thought that in his desire to become stronger, he had recklessly dabbled in black magic. But there were also a few who had a change of heart and admired him, even hoping he would deliver justice on behalf of heaven, to straighten out those kids who acted high and mighty just because they had some strength. That day, in the training camp's dining hall, Rick's cousins had gathered in one place. They all shared a common goal. That was to defeat Rick. The most frustrated one in the group right now was surely Leon. A week had passed, but the wounds Rick had inflicted on him still hadn't healed. Both Leon and Zagel were worried as Rick was gradually becoming stronger. But Owen, the calmest-looking kid in the group, casually put on the air of a strategist. Don't worry. The Pancration match was barbaric but also impressive. However, Rick will soon be utterly defeated when it comes to swordsmanship. What can he do when he can't even hold a sword properly? As Owen said this, Leon and the others began to relax. Come to think of it, his body is so weak he can't lift a regular sword because it's too heavy, so he even had to order a custom one. He definitely beat me by luck. There's no way I could lose to that weakling. Leon was still fuming. At this moment, Gina, who had been the quietest until now and was only focused on eating her steak, suddenly slammed the table and stood up. Luck? If you truly believe Rick was just lucky, then none of you have the right to become knights of this Draker family. After saying that, Gina bluntly walked away. But one could also understand why Rick's cousins were so eagerly awaiting the day of the swordsmanship competition. Unlike Pancration, real swords would be used in this match, and it was also the cause of most of the accidents that occurred in the training camp. A sword fight was the place that most clearly showed the skill gap between students. Soon, the swordsmanship exam arrived. Unlike what the students had imagined, this time Rick was wielding a ridiculously long sword. It looked very heavy too, yet he held it as if it were nothing. In the first match, Gina was the one who proactively stepped forward to challenge him. And Rick agreed. When faced with, and seeing the way he confidently swung that long sword, Gina could almost certainly say that this was no longer the Rick she once knew. Because the Rick she knew was someone who could barely even lift a sword. In fact, his current appearance even made Gina feel threatened. She tried to calm herself down, and at the same time, drew her own weapon. In truth, Rick was not as comfortable as he appeared on the outside, because fighting against Thunder Knights was something that made him extremely tense, whether in his past life or this one. And Gina Turuin standing before him was just such a Thunder Knight. In his past life, she was one of the knights who had made a name for herself in the Continental War. She was also recognized as one of the strongest in the next generation of the Draker family, being one of those who awakened their aura even before entering the blessing ceremony. Rick remembered that Gina had awakened her aura a few years before this point in time, but she didn't use it in the training camp, and the reason was that she wanted to improve her fundamentals. That was also why the likes of Leon and Zagel were afraid of Gina. After all, compared to that trash, this girl was a much more worthy opponent for Rick to respect. As soon as bands signaled for the match to begin, Gina impatiently attacked first. Her opponent's movements were extremely swift. Her sword path was also decisive and sharp, so Rick didn't dare to be careless. She was even better than he had expected, but Rick knew he wouldn't lose. Stop playing with him. Finish him with one blow, Gina. The students watching the match began to cheer. What a joke. Zagel, sitting in the front row, started to grumble. Does it look like Gina is playing with him? The kid seemed unusually smart today. He knew Gina was giving it her all, but it still wasn't enough to touch Rick's weak point. She was trying extremely hard, and also struggling immensely. After a few moves were blocked by Rick, Gina finally found a gap in her opponent's defense. However, even if she attacked that position with lightning speed, in the end, the thing the tip of Gina's sword touched was still not Rick's flesh, but his sword. Rick was still one step ahead of her, as if praising her effort to find an opportunity, and also as if insulting her. He kept revealing openings, and then continuously parried her blows when Gina attacked. This made her feel like Rick was completely leading the rhythm of the fight, and Rick was turning a life-or-death competition into a friendly training match to teach her. Their blades clashed once again. This time, Gina was knocked far away. She panted from exhaustion, while Rick seemed unusually relaxed. He couldn't help but sigh. It was true that before becoming a Thunder Knight, Gina was also just a child. The way she fought back and battled while still at the training camp could be described in one word: immature. Her sword was very straightforward. That was what Rick saw most clearly in this person obsessed with her so-called fundamentals. And it was also the thing that held Gina back the most. Therefore, he wanted to help her break out of her cocoon and become a brilliant butterfly with her extraordinary swordsmanship talent. Thinking this, Rick's center of gravity suddenly dropped. He assumed an extremely low stance with the oversized longsword in his hand. Gina mentally calculated, guessing that her opponent was planning to close the distance in one blow. Her speed was not to be trifled with, so Gina believed she could handle that attack. Come on, Rick Draker, Gina thought. And then, just as expected, Rick suddenly lunged forward, charging like a tiger pouncing on its prey. It's just that his speed was faster than Gina had imagined. She didn't dare to block. Instead, she had to hastily retreat to avoid her opponent's blade. However, constantly increasing the distance and dodging like this was not a way to win. Gina was extremely frustrated. While Rick continuously attacked, she was constantly struggling to cope. And then, he once again suddenly shortened the distance and attacked. Gina's eyes widened in horror. Only 3 words appeared in her mind. I'm done for. After that, she gritted her teeth. Instead of dodging, she counterattacked. Rick's long sword was knocked into the air, falling behind him and embedding itself deep into the ground. The students immediately stood up and cheered. Rick lost. Gina is amazing, as expected. She didn't even need to use aura to defeat that failure. Only Banmark realized the problem here. When Rick's final attack approached Gina, she had used aura, with the smallest possible amount. It could be said to be an amount of aura so small, it was almost undetectable. Gina was someone who had sworn never to use aura until she officially joined the academy. And today, Rick had forced her to do it just to save her own life. Perhaps it was because of this that Gina stood there in a daze, completely ignoring the cheers calling her name. What are you doing? Focus. It's not over yet. Rick's voice snapped her out of it. But it was too late. By the time Gina realized what was happening, Rick had already closed in on her and landed a punch on her chest. Gina immediately coughed up a large mouthful of blood, forced to kneel on one knee. Her whole body trembled uncontrollably. This is a sword fight. We won't tolerate a cowardly attack from a failure like you. The person involved hadn't even spoken yet, but up in the stands, Leon was already roaring. That's right. A knight who throws away his sword? Ridiculous. The other students began to chime in. This is Gina's victory. You don't have the qualities to be a knight. What a disgrace. The students up there were furiously scolding Rick, making him feel as if each one spitting would be enough to drown him. Gina, after a few hacking coughs, stood up. Want to continue? Rick asked. She hadn't admitted defeat yet. The first thought that came to Gina's mind was that he had only been able to hit her because she was careless. But in the end, she was still an honest person. If Rick hadn't used his bare hands, but had a dagger just now, her throat would have been slit in two. Thinking of this, Gina's brows furrowed tightly. With difficulty, she uttered a sentence. I lost. The entire stand, which had been busy cursing Rick, immediately fell silent. They were busy looking at Rick Draker, the person who just a few days ago was reviled as human trash. Yet now, he had achieved victory against one of the most brightly talented children from the prestigious families, Gina Turuin. The matter of Rick suddenly changing and becoming a different person had reached his older brother, Abel. In the fight for succession, the children of the Dragon Slayer family were all extremely tense. Therefore, Abel, a person who almost never had the concept of returning home to visit, decided to return to the family for a while before the blessing ceremony officially took place. For a very simple reason. He wanted to know what awakening had made his youngest brother become such a different person. After Rick's victory against Gina, the entire training academy was in deep shock. But this seemed to have no effect on his life. Rick simply returned to his personal training room and continued to practice. Another month passed, and the blessing ceremony finally arrived. Even so, Rick still maintained his daily training routine. Because of this, his body was now much better than when he had just been reincarnated. Rick opened his status window to check. Just as he had expected, most of his skills had increased in level. Among them were skills that had reached the master level. He had even managed to raise the proficiency of flexible footwork, the skill he had obtained while fighting. The sound of footsteps echoed from outside. Rick immediately guessed it was Deeker. Sure enough, a voice then called from inside. Young master, we will be departing in 2 hours. I'll be there soon. Just get everything ready. After bathing and changing properly, Rick was in the carriage on his way back to the family's main mansion. If you included the time in his previous life, it had been a very long time since he had returned to that castle. It belonged to the Draker family and was located in the territory of the Duke of the Sky. Although the cradle was located in the center of the continent, at the Fortress of Four Seasons in the Central Plains, the blessing ceremony still had to be held at the main mansion, the origin of the Dragon Slayer legend. That castle also had another very grand name. It was the Dragon's Lair. After an unknown amount of time, when the carriage stopped, Rick stepped down and looked at the castle with an indescribable emotion. Even though he was a direct descendant, he still stood with the other students of the family, not favored in the slightest. During this process, Rick constantly looked around and noticed something he had never noticed before. That all the guests present at the ceremony were famous people whose names he had only ever heard through the continental press. Rick was sure that among those pairs of eyes, half were fixed on him. But no matter what their intentions were, as soon as they saw him fail to awaken, they would ignore him. And then Rick's gaze suddenly stopped on a tall figure. The appearance was enough to make the expression on his face gradually lose control. This person was shaking hands and greeting the guests, and it seemed everyone was surprised to see him here. Well, I really did have a motive for coming back here today. Because coincidentally, my adorable youngest brother is also here. There he is. That face, Rick could never forget. He was Abel Draker, the second son of the family, currently known as the Sword Lion. But in his previous life, he had another name, the Butcher Knight. As soon as he saw this brother, Rick was so angry he was seeing red, but he could only force himself to calm down because there was nothing he could do right now. He just remembered that in his previous life, Abel didn't even bother to see him during the blessing ceremony. But today he appeared here, which meant his actions had changed the future. If so, this could be an opportunity for Rick to change his cruel fate. When the guests above had settled down, the blessing ceremony officially began. The first person to be called was Aaron. The child trembled as he walked forward. There was a basin of holy water placed before a statue of a knight and 2 mana lamps. If one awakened aura, the statue would react. If one awakened mana, the lamps would react. Aaron took a deep breath, then rolled up his sleeves and plunged his hand straight into it. Through this blessing ceremony, all members of the Draker lineage who were 12 years old and had graduated from the cradle would awaken their sealed aura. And Aaron had successfully and smoothly done this first. Compared to ordinary knights from other families, the milestone of 12 years old was very early because they usually only awakened after the age of 20. Among these children, there were also some rare cases where, along with aura, they would also awaken a Dragon Slayer characteristic called mana suppression. At this time, the 2 mana lamps placed at the scene would react, emitting a red light. These super rare cases would, in the future, at least reach the level of a yellow swordsman. A few would even be on par with crimson and black knights. Awakening aura simultaneously with mana suppression meant that the child had awakened true blood, a genius. And this year, there was one such case. Unsurprisingly, it was Gina. As soon as she awakened mana suppression, Instructor Ban immediately requested a servant to bring him gloves. Because of that important characteristic, all who awakened it had to wear a pair of special gloves made by the family. Otherwise, they couldn't live a normal life. The moment a person proved themselves to be a descendant of the true bloodline, they would be granted the Draker's surname in their name, regardless of whether they were a direct descendant or not. Along with that, they would also receive an unimaginably large amount of funding and countless benefits from the family. But even Gina, with her boundless future, didn't make people anticipate as much as Rick. Most of the guests thought he would also awaken true blood, because he was the one who had defeated Gina, after all. Rick slowly walked forward. He never thought he would have the chance to stand before this statue again. In his past life, he had a truly terrible experience in front of it. Although that blessing ceremony was the only thing that motivated him to overcome all the difficulties at the cradle, in the end, he only received a disgraceful title, the failure of the family. However, this life might be different. Rick not only had superhuman healing abilities, but could also use the Ether Hall, something that no one else besides his master and him could open. Above all, he had not given up and surrendered, but had stood up on his own will. Even so, please help me out, you damn parameter statue, Rick thought to himself. Then he rolled up his sleeves and dipped his hand into the basin of water like everyone else. When Rick's hand touched the water's surface, the night statue suddenly shook violently. Then it stopped just as quickly. The entire room fell into a terrifying silence. Damn it, he cursed silently. He knew he shouldn't have expected the future to change. It was just that Abel's sudden appearance here had made him overconfident. Just like in his previous life, whispers began to rise in the large hall. He failed to awaken? Is that possible? It seems the family head's blood isn't enough to suppress the cursed blood. Then how did he defeat Gina? He must have cheated, right? What a disgrace to the family. Rick clicked his tongue. The reactions of these people were no different from his previous life. But failing to awaken Aura was no longer important to him now, because Rick had many other ways to become stronger besides through awakening. At that moment, the system sent a few new notifications. I apologize, Rick. Due to a processing error, a message was delayed. Necessary information was found to be missing from the identification mechanism during the class identification process. Class information has been inserted using system administrator privileges. Rick read the notification several times, half believing, half doubting. Although it was a bit long-winded, it seemed his failure to awaken just now was due to missing information during the identification process, and the system had quickly fixed the error automatically. First, it unlocked Rick's rare class, Healing Sorcerer. When this message was sent, the night statue began to emit a red light similar to when Gina awakened. Public opinion quickly turned because of this. It's that red color. It's another true blood awakening. It didn't stop there. The system also automatically created a connection. The title, Blessed by the Ancient Dragon, which was sealed in his soul, was also unlocked. At the same time, the talent of the Draker lineage flowing in his blood, the fighter's bloodline, was also awakened. These three things, Healing Sorcerer, Blessed by the Ancient Dragon, and Fighter's Bloodline combined together, ultimately creating a new, one-of-a-kind class named Immortal. At the same time, the color on the statue began to change from red to gold. This was a phenomenon that had never happened before, so the witnesses at that time couldn't hide their questions. Rick decided to remain silent and let them speculate. After all, he couldn't just announce that he had just awakened a unique class. The mana lamps didn't react at all. So was the sword statue faulty, right? If there's no mana suppression, it can't be considered a true blood awakening. Finally, Abel's applause silenced the whispers in the crowd. Don't look so serious. We have 2 true blood awakeners in one batch. Isn't this something worth celebrating? He said. Everyone looked at each other with eyes full of doubt. But in reality, the second son of the Draker family was very influential. Since he said so, it meant he acknowledged that his younger brother had awakened true blood, so no one dared to object anymore. Rick, who had just been doubted and whispered about by them, now, along with Gina, became the blessing of the family. Abel immediately ordered a servant to bring gloves for Rick, while also shifting the public's attention to the next child. Rick put on the gloves and slowly walked away. He could clearly see his brother's intentions. But being forced to accept his help made Rick feel like he had eaten shit. After a few more children, the blessing ceremony finally ended. To celebrate the new generation of the family, a lavish banquet was held. But Rick had no interest in these extravagant parties. He wanted to find the training room in the main mansion. But he was blocked by Abel. The party has just begun. Where are you going? Rick tried to restrain his dagger-like glare. He didn't think Abel would be so eager to strike up a conversation with him so quickly. His eyes were also full of danger and scrutiny, but in the end, he still put on a friendly face and congratulated Rick on awakening true blood. At the same time, he extended his hand. With great reluctance, but knowing that not shaking it would reveal his hostility too clearly, he reluctantly reached out his hand. But before he could even touch Abel's hand, the terrifying memories of his past life flooded back. Rick froze, his hand hovering in midair, and finally lowered it. In that moment, he had decided. Even to save face, he could not shake this scumbag's hand. Abel was left hanging awkwardly. He had to speak up to save himself from the embarrassment. Well, this is awkward. TCH, Rick scoffed. But you'll have to live with it. You'll just have to be content with seeing my face more often from now on. See you later. As he passed by Rick, Abel deliberately patted his shoulder a few times, which disgusted Rick immensely. Those 3 words, see you later, were nothing short of a challenge to him. Rick swore that in the future, he would make this bastard taste everything he had caused in his past life. Back to the party. Unsurprisingly, everyone was talking about the two children who had just awakened True Blood. Especially Rick, because he possessed an incredibly distinct golden light. Most of them had thought he had failed to awaken. But before they could look down on him, Rick had created such a shocking event. Yet the main character was nowhere to be seen. Rick had already returned to his private room. He took off the heavy outer clothes and breathed, including that pair of special gloves. To be honest, he was also thinking a little about what had just happened. All children who awaken True Blood will carry the mana suppression trait. It is the ability that proves you are an enemy of dragons, the source of mana, a true descendant of the dragon slayers. However, because most machines use mana as fuel, that's why children who awaken True Blood are required to use the family's specially made gloves. That also means, if Rick were truly a True Blood, then there would have been a problem when he took off his gloves. But now he was still completely fine. Rick swiped his hand to open the status window. His class had changed from Healing Sorcerer to Immortal. In addition, there were two new skills, Mana Inversion, A, and Overall, A. Rick let out an "oh." These two things were indeed new. And it was Mana Inversion, not Mana Suppression. This skill allowed him to create a distorted environment to neutralize nearby mana. Compared to Mana Suppression, which was like a passive skill, Mana Inversion was an active skill. That's why the mana lamps didn't react back then. Rick felt it was truly miraculous. Before the blessing ceremony, he was a rare healing sorcerer, but now he possessed the unique immortal class. But the more he thought about it, the more confusing it became. While all the students who graduated from the cradle had awakened with blue aura, only Gina, who had awakened True Blood, had a red light. Rick was different from all of them. At first, it was also red. Then it turned golden. He remembered the system's previous notification. It said that the identification mechanism couldn't function correctly due to missing essential information. So, was that identification mechanism referring to the knight statue in front of the holy water basin? Then, the system inserted Rick's class information by using system administrator privileges, and immediately the statue emitted a red light. After combining the classes, it turned golden. Now, thinking about it carefully, Rick realized that the bronze statue didn't determine whether you awakened or not. Instead, it determined the user's characteristics and their class. Red represented a rare class, like when Rick was a healing sorcerer, and gold for a unique class, when he had become an immortal. Rick remembered that the bronze statue was an ancient treasure used even before the time of his ancestor, Taran Drak, who founded the family. Because the concept of classes no longer existed in this era, it was only used to determine if a person had awakened or not. And from generation to generation, they had mistakenly established that the red light, which indicated you possessed a rare class, was the sign of a True Blood awakening. He didn't know which generation of family heads would discover this mistake, but Rick was sure he would keep his mouth shut. There was another important thing. He had earned 100 karma points. Although he didn't know exactly how he got them, Rick was eager to use them right away to see the dragon skills. A few options appeared before Rick. All of them were level 1 dragon skills that were currently sealed. First was Dragon's Eye, which allowed the user to view detailed information about others. It cost 20 points to unlock. Next was Dragon's Might, which allowed the user to make enemies surrender with aura. It cost 30 points to unlock. And finally, Devour, which allowed the user to eat a lot and digest quickly. It cost 50 points to unlock. Rick pondered. He understood the effects of Dragon's Eye and Dragon's Might. But what was the use of Devour, which allowed one to eat a lot? Moreover, it cost a whopping 50 points to unlock. After some thought, Rick decided to choose the obvious option rather than take a risk. And he used another 50 points to unlock the two skills,